My name is John McKeon. I'm the moderator for the Teradata River, and today we have with us Joe Stanhope, Senior Analyst for Forrester Research on Web Intelligence. Joe, welcome back to the River.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Joe, you are working in the space of web intelligence, and I think that we've seen a huge transformation over the past couple of years. Where are we, and what are the big challenges that organizations have to really drive out of an experimentation phase and maybe into a more of a cohesive strategy to really bring the value out of the data?
Well, at Forrester, we've certainly seen a real surge in the interest level in web intelligence, not just, say, single channels or discrete channels in the digital marketing mix, but in bringing everything together. And I like to chalk that up to the overall level, I think, of complexity that organizations are running into. We still have some of the traditional issues in marketing that unfortunately are still challenging, things like silos of data and increasingly sophisticated consumers and the desire to have a consistent experience across different touch points. But in the last couple of years, I think we've seen a dramatic escalation on top of those historical challenges that have really amped up the overall level of complexity that organizations see. And, of course, the poster children for this would be emerging channels like social and mobile. Have really exploded out the number of touch points, the speed at which marketing moves. The walled gardens around these technologies make it impossible to write once, publish many times. So the technology, the budgeting, the measurement, the processes for marketing are really all under strain to try to keep up with this rapidly evolving, increasingly complex environment that marketers have to keep up with in order to do their jobs and make their numbers and keep their customers happy, who are still getting increasingly sophisticated and demanding.
Joe, you are visiting a lot of companies out there, a lot of organizations dealing with this. What are the three biggest alligators you see with handling complexity?
Well, I think that if there is a nice thing, the nice thing about the complexity is that it's an equal opportunity disruptor. It affects every company and every industry. Now, there's nuances to that, of course, but everyone feels the pinch. And that creates an opportunity for organizations. So if organizations think about what data matters to them, how can they get a holistic view of that data, and how can they make it actionable, they can really turn this into an opportunity for themselves. And a lot of companies do get really wrapped up in things like just buying some technology or having to make all the data integrations perfect and having to wrap everything up just right with a bow on it before they do anything. And I think what we're finding out is, even if you did everything nailed down, the whole environment is evolving and moving too fast to try to do it once and be done. It's going to be a long-term project. This is not a one-off. So organizations are coming around to how do we get, frankly, good enough data that we can take action on? How do we experiment in this environment to figure out what matters and what doesn't? And how do we really prioritize our resources to go after the low-hanging fruit and then make the ongoing investments that make the most sense for us, not based necessarily on peer pressure?
Well, Joe, I think a lot of this, too, is when you have complexity and you're trying to bring out the value in the data, part of it is process, but part of it is strategy. So what are some words of advice to actually create a strategy, or does that come from understanding the data first?
I usually tell people to think about it from a top-down perspective. I like for people to think about the strategy actually before they think about anything else, and to build actually a roadmap for addressing complexity based on that, addressing not only that complexity, but how does web intelligence fit into turning it from an obstacle into an opportunity. And the two things I start with in terms of strategy are, one, thinking about what's the ideal customer experience that you want to provide. And that's, of course, a customer experience that makes customers happy, but one that's also mutually beneficial. What's the customer experience that drives value for your firm? And second, thinking about across all these channels at the enterprise level, what is the customer contact strategy? One of the offshoots of complexity is that we don't operate in swim lanes anymore or have really discrete channels, at least not in the minds of consumers. People move across channels very easily, and they use multiple channels concurrently. And that means we really have to go back and rethink that customer contact strategy at the strategic level and understand how these channels interplay with one another, how they're perceived, what purposes they serve, what the intent is for them, and how we can use them in a cohesive manner.
Joe, I think one of the big things here also is skill level. What has been your observation? Are organizations skilled correctly at this level, or do they need additional resource?
I think resources and processes Both need to be examined to take advantage of complexity and to enhance web intelligence in organizations. It's not just a technology game, and it's not just about the strategy. There's a lot of stuff that happens in between those 2 points on the roadmap spectrum. And certainly, it's a lot easier to do things in discrete channels, I think. You don't need all that collaboration and coordination and really advanced skills as much as you do when you do everything in silos. So when you start pulling things together, not only the data, but making it actionable and having a universal understanding and moving towards these, enterprise strategies of customer experience and based on an enterprise customer contact strategy, it gets a lot more difficult. So you need to have the skills that are used to dealing with big data and deeper analytics and moving across channels. You also have to have the staffing. You have to have the physical bandwidth within the hours of a day to do all of that work. It also trickles down to processes. How are people going to collaborate? And how do your planning processes change when you have an ideal customer experience and a global customer contact strategy? All those things take skills and they take time. And organizations have to consider, how are we going to get that? Are we going to build it up? Are we going to hire it, develop it? Are we going to rely on third parties for part of that? Because it has to come from somewhere. Technology is a really good enabler of a lot of these things, but it doesn't actually do the job for you.
Joe, how much have you seen organizations trying to use the old rules in the new environment, and when do they work and when do they not work?
I think we're really early in that stage. I think a lot of organizations, especially those that have a non-transactional digital archetype, certainly it's one thing when you're talking about e-commerce and retail and you're getting people to the website, pushing them through a funnel, getting them to buy something. That's very different. But for the rest of us who have non-transactional archetypes, particularly, it's been slow in coming to realize that there's more to the relationship than driving traffic. A lot of organizations that I talk to are finally starting to come around to, look, we've spent the last few years heavily focused on things like search and landing pages and just driving traffic and maybe newsletter signups and things like that. And now they're realizing, look, we have a multi-year relationship, a longitudinal relationship with people, and we need to optimize that entire relationship, not just the traffic building phase of that relationship. And that's a big sea change. I think having that realization is really important in a lot of companies, and now a lot of them are starting to try to pivot technically and personnel-wise to take advantage of that realization.
Joe, what about the growing sense from the executives that are saying, show me the money? Is that mantra going to help or hurt innovation in this space?
Well, I think a lot of executives say that, and I think not all companies live it. You see a lot of variance. That's a relatively broad generalization. I think there is certainly pressure. Technically, we might be out of the recession now, but certainly we live in an age of austerity. I don't think anyone would say that everything is completely bounced back yet, so companies do have to be really cognizant of the money they're spending, how they spend them. That certainly extends to marketing, not only for how they budget for programs, but how they get resources, like people. And there's not really a plan B if you're spending money. There's a very strong opportunity cost to how you spend dollars. And so I think companies are thinking really, really hard about it. But there is also an underlying current of we have to do better to engage with customers because the expectations and the competitiveness is so intense. And you see the push-pull between making money and attribution and needing to have a presence and experiment and learn the most in the emerging channels like social and mobile. Companies feel tremendous pressure to be involved in those now, and for good reason, but they're still very nascent channels in terms of our understanding of them and as they evolve. So there's really an internal underlying battle happening between how do you get involved in these channels and learn from them and still try to make money, because that is not necessarily clear in those channels yet.
Joe Stanhope, Senior Analyst for Forrester Research on Web Intelligence. He will be speaking at the upcoming Partners Conference on transforming web data into web intelligence to inform market strategy. It should be a great session, and I encourage you to attend it. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, John. See you in October.